Hey all, thank you all for being here. I'm Ketan. I'm really excited to be here. And then just to kind of make a quick point about Josh, he always has something really insightful to say, and we have a lot to learn from him. So I personally always look forward to his talks. But today, I want to talk about user research. And I want to share a little bit about what I think about user research from a PM perspective. And then I want to share a few stories that I've gone through when I've done user research as a PM. But before I dive in, as the intro said, I'm a PM at Dropbox. At Dropbox, I'm currently working on building out our product ecosystem and our Dropbox platform through our strategic integrations and partnerships. I've been at Dropbox for a little over a year, close to a year and a half at this point, and prior to that, I worked on our growth side of the world. I worked on analytics, data infra, experimentation, kind of points that Byron talked about earlier. Before joining Dropbox, I worked at an enterprise SaaS company for a few years, and before that, I tried unsuccessfully building startups out of MIT. But user research, right? What is the value of talking about user research? Why is it worth talking about? As PMs or aspiring PMs, the first thing that you hear about is, as a product manager, you have to be user-centric. Think about the user, right? So what new thing is there to be said here? And so if you were to ask me, hey Ketan, what do you think is the value of user research? I would recite to you this sentence, which happens to be the mission statement of our user research team. And it goes like this: empower people by inspiring empathy and uncovering truths. So there are three elements to this: empower people, inspire empathy, and uncover truths. So empowering people, you can empower two groups of people. The first group of people is the people at your own company. If you do great user research, your engineers will work on the right things. They'll build the right product. You'll enable marketing to give the right message. You'll enable salespeople to target the right audiences or customers. But more importantly, you can empower the most important group, that is your users. You can empower them to overcome their needs and struggles by building a very beautiful product. The second thing is inspiring empathy. We're all creators here as PMs. And what empathy does is it inspires us to deeply understand our customers and build delightful products. Finally, uncovering truths allows us as PMs or product people to minimize risks in the product development process by validating or invalidating any assumptions that we may have about our product or about our users. But anyway, I was thinking about this statement, and I was like thinking about this talk a couple of weeks ago, and I was trying to think like, how can I explain these topics? Like, how can I break this down and make this talk kind of interesting? And I actually ended up thinking about like something totally random and different. Maybe it was just me procrastinating, or maybe I was just hungry, but I ended up thinking about this dessert. This like humongous dessert that I had a couple of months ago at this place called Boston Burger Company back in Boston. It's this restaurant, Boston Burger Company, is really famous for their desserts. Like, I don't have to prove why. I think you can, the proof is in, I guess, the image. I wouldn't say pudding. But what I realized when I thought about this was that the three concepts that I wanted to kind of communicate were easily communicatable, or the things in this dessert, the milkshake, the cake, and the cookies, were the three aspects of this dessert. And I thought that this dessert had some interesting lessons to share about those three different topics. So what I want to do today is talk about these three things, or these three concepts, and talk about how you can better empower people via milkshakes, how you can inspire empathy via cupcakes, and how you can uncover truths via cookies. Not sure what I mean? Let's dive in. So first, let's talk about milkshakes. Imagine for a second that you're the manager for a milkshake line at one of these like milkshake companies. And you're told, let's improve this milkshake, make it better, and get customers to buy more of it. How would you go about doing that? You would go by, if you're following things traditionally, you would go find out your competitors, who else is selling milkshakes, you would do a market analysis, you would do a user segment analysis, you might go run some customer surveys, you might ask the customer, say, hey, how can I create a better milkshake for you? And turns out, that is exactly what these milkshake companies did, and they failed. And Clayton Christensen, who you may have heard of from the disruptive innovation kind of fame, wrote in his book, Competing Against Luck, and he asked the same question and recommended a totally different approach. And FYI, in terms of book plugs, I would highly, highly recommend people to read Competing Against Luck. Really amazing book for user research and understanding the user. But what Clayton recommended was to ask a slightly different question. The question was, what jobs are your customers hiring this milkshake to do? Right? And that entirely ended up spawning off this jobs to be done theory that Josh briefly mentioned in his talk. But the primary premise of this theory is to ask and figure out what kind of jobs arise in your customers' lives, what are the circumstances in which these jobs arise, and how can your product be hired to do those jobs. And turns out in his research, Clayton and the milkshake folks discovered that there are two groups of users who actually buy milkshakes. The first group is the group that buys milkshake early in the morning. They go out to the store alone, by themselves, and buy a big milkshake. And turns out they buy this milkshake for their long commute so that they want to keep their commute interesting. And the aspects of the milkshake that they value the most is the fact that it takes a really long time to finish and it keeps them full. So a better milkshake for them is something that actually takes a longer time to finish. So for them, having a narrower straw is actually a better product. The second group of users that Clayton looked at were parents who went into these milkshake stores late in the afternoon with their kids, and the kids asked the parent, like, hey dad, can I get a milkshake? And the dad didn't want to say no, and at the same time didn't want to feel guilty, so they would buy the milkshake. But if you think about it, for this group of users, the improvement is entirely different, right? The job that they're hiring the milkshake to do is to keep their kids happy and at the same time not feel guilty. And the improvement for this group would be a milkshake of a smaller size. So in this case, like the milkshake is being used by two different groups of customers for two entirely different jobs. And what it's revealing is there are like totally non-intuitive ways to make the product better, right? If I were to ask you, can you make a milkshake better? You'd probably think, oh, can I add more chocolate to it? Can I add more nuts to it? Can I make it chewier? Can I change different flavors? But the two improvements, a narrower straw and a smaller size, are totally non-intuitive. But the jobs theory and asking the question a slightly different way allows you to get to the heart of the problem and how you can make the product better. And the larger point here is customers don't want products. They want something, they want to hire something that fixes their problems. They want something that does that job. Right? And the value of jobs theory is that jobs remain stable over time. So rather than relying on something that's more variable, like a feature request or some random idea, you're relying on something that's consistently existing in your user's life over time to make sure that you're building something on a stable foundation. So consider this job of, I want to listen to music to change my mood. Now, that job has remained the same over decades. But the way we solve it, whether it was the cassette tapes like many decades ago to like Spotify or some other streaming services, the way you solve that job is different now. And an easier way to think about this is the quote by the HBS professor Theodore Levitt, who said, customers don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. But then you might ask me, okay, so jobs to be done, or JTBD for short, is great. But what about user stories then? Like, am I not supposed to use user stories to build my products? Well, what I would argue is jobs to be done is actually a special type of user story. It's just a little bit more nuanced, and it's a little bit scoped differently. The jobs to be done is scoped to that moment of purchase when the user hires your product to solve a particular job or a struggle that they're experiencing. So a jobs to be done can be framed something like, I'm coming to Dropbox because I need one organized place for my team's work. A user story is a little bit more specific, and it allows you to ensure that you are realizing more ongoing value with your product. And you convert that initial purchase to a more long-term successful customer. And a user story is more specific and is at a feature level. So a user story would probably go something like, when I am working on a shared file, I want to access the latest version so that I don't end up duplicating my files. So something like that. But the higher level concept is jobs to be done, focuses on the product level, more abstract, user stories more specific, more at the feature level. And at Dropbox, we use the jobs to be done theory extensively as a part of our user research. And as I mentioned about jobs theory is really effective at the product level. So the kind of questions that we ask on the product team are, what kind of jobs are our users hiring Dropbox for Business to do? And in our case, each of our products, or in anyone's case, each of our products has multiple jobs to be done. Now, Milkshake that I talked about had multiple jobs to be done. But as a user, ultimately you are buying the product because it meets that one critical job that you care about. And that job is done via a subset of features that your product may have. If the product lacks some features, then they may not be able to do the job and they may not purchase the product, but that is the decision flow where they think in terms of jobs. Cool, so what is the key takeaway at this point? The key takeaway is, in terms of empowering people, put yourself in the shoes of that Milkshake manager and think about the jobs to be done. Ask this question, what jobs are your customers trying to do? What struggles are they facing? And how can they hire your product to do their jobs? And how can you incorporate the jobs theory on top of any user research that you're already doing? Next up, Cupcake. So this smiling cupcake which starts shooting out of its head is actually one of Dropbox's company values. We have 5 company values, and one of this is simply a cupcake. And what the cupcake represents is the delight that a user has to experience when they use your product. And internally, when we build something that's really a great user experience, solves a problem elegantly, we actually call it like a cupcake experience. So the point here is, you want your customers to be delighted, but the only way that you can make your customers happy and be delighted with the product is if you can build something that has been built with a deep sense of empathy to your user. You have to have that deep understanding of how your user feels and be empathetic to them in various dimensions to make your product successful. So let me share an example of my own story. So when I was a PM for the very first time back at that analytics startup, one of the first projects I was asked to work on was this predictive model. And I was told, hey, Ketan, just go and improve this predictive model. And at that time, I had understood that understanding the user is important, user empathy mattered, but I didn't really internalize how much it mattered for product adoption. So I went in and I said, okay, customers prefer a better predictive model, let's build this. And I spent 6 months with my team. We built a predictive model that was 2 times better. And then we launched this, we put this in like a really prominent spot in the product, and then a couple of weeks later, I keep looking at the dashboards. There is no spike, there's no hockey stick, there is like barely like a worm crawling on the ground. And so I was like, what's happening here? What's going on? And turns out our users of the software were primarily like marketing analysts or sales analysts who, in addition to running these analyses, also had to present these analyses to their bosses. And they weren't like stat savvy or like data savvy people. They just like, were doing this as like an additional part of their role. And when we shipped this model was a little bit more complicated and black boxy, and our users struggled to understand it and explain it to their bosses. So even though we showed that it was 2x better, customers, like the users knew that it was 2 times better, they simply refused to use it simply because they couldn't explain it. And I, as a PM, had understood one aspect of why they needed a better model to make better predictions. But I hadn't really internalized why certain aspects of things mattered and why the explainability mattered way more. So in this sense, this was like a lesson for me to be more cognizant and be more aware of asking that question, why? And so if I were to do this ideally, how would I go about doing this? Some of you may have seen this diagram. It's called the double diamond model of design. This was, I guess, originally published by this British Design Council maybe in 2005. But what this states is maybe a template to go from a generic problem to a specific solution. So the way this goes is you start off with like a generic problem that you're setting out to solve. You then use user research to expand your knowledge of the world, and then you use insight about your users to constrain and come back to that specific problem definition. Once you have that specific problem definition, you then ideate to expand to the set of solutions that can meet the address a specific problem. And then through prototyping, you figure out what is the specific solution for that generic problem you set out to solve. Now, in my case, I actually conflated, in the previous example, I ended up conflating the general problem for the specific definition. And I totally ended up skipping that first bucket where we ended up thinking about like, how can we improve the model? How can we make it better? How can we like launch it? But we totally missed this initial aspect of asking why. And what I want you all to think a little bit more about is how can you create a product process, or how can you incorporate something in your product process that allows you to explicitly focus on that first diamond? How can you ask that question why and figure out the needs of your customer and deeply empathize with them? And at Dropbox, I feel the product process is designed to capture some of this pretty well. So in Dropbox, one of the things that we do is we have a product process that happens in multiple phases. We have a what is called as a phase 0, where we ask the question, why does this matter? Why is this important now? And we hold a review with leadership to make sure that everyone's aligned. And in the phase 0, we try answering questions like, who are our users? Who are our user segments? What are their problems? What are the problems for Dropbox? What are the opportunities? What do we believe are hypotheses for success? And once that is like formalized and like presented and set in stone, is when you'll start answering the next questions on the how and the what. And not all phase 0s go through. This is not like an exercise just for process sake. There are plenty of phase 0s that get rejected, that go back, like reframed and so on. But once the phase 0 is clear, we start working on the how, which is that second diamond of figuring out like what are the different solution options and how can we identify the right solution to address a problem. And only following that will we go to the what, which is the details and the spec and the figuring out like what does the details of the mock look like, where should the UI elements look like. 2 phases before that is asking the more fundamental questions around the why and the how. So my second takeaway around inspiring empathy or being deeply empathetic is to think about that cupcake value and always remember to start with the why. Only when you can deeply empathize with the user and think about the why can you then create an experience that's truly delightful. And only following that you can then figure out what the hows and the whats and the details of the implementation. Next up is cookies. But what I'm talking about are not these cookies, but HTTP cookies that you can then use to track user behavior and data. So I really believe in the value of quantitative information. I think the talks earlier talked about how you can use better metrics, how you can use experimentation to drive to an interesting understanding of your users. But quantitative analyses can be really, really powerful. So a really good example is this inflection point type analysis that Josh was referring to earlier, where Twitter found that past 30 followers, that's when you become sticky. Facebook initially found that past 7 friends, that's when you become sticky. On Dropbox's own ecosystem platform where I now work, we found that linking your Dropbox with third-party apps beyond a certain level has the tendency to make your product really, really sticky. So there are these inflection points that really matter. But what I want to talk about is more broadly, on top of these anecdotes like the jobs or asking customers the why, like understanding the stories, how can you incorporate more quantitative information and why is that valuable? So I want to share another story of my own here around quantification of kind of user behavior. A while ago, I was working on this product that had 2 separate flows in it. Let's call them flow A and flow B. And we were trying to revamp this product. And I went to users and I asked them, hey guys, how often do you use flow B? We were trying to figure out how can the UI look and so on. So how often do you use flow B? And most users said, maybe 25 to 30% of the time is when we use flow B. And so we went back to the drawing board, designed some UIs and figured out what the entry point should look like. But then I stumbled upon some data for the old product. I actually pulled in some information on the usage. And turns out, users were using flow B only 6% of the time. Which means flow A went from a perceived 70% of the time to a real 94% of the time that it was being used. Again, ties back to the first talk around cognitive bias, where users will misrepresent or they don't themselves understand how they're using the product. And in some ways, you want to add in that quantitative element to make sure that you are assuming things correctly and that you're not like building a product on top of kind of assumptions based on some stories. The second example I have is from Facebook, actually. So there are situations where your users may simply don't understand what they want. I think like there are a lot of examples in history where people say, like Steve Jobs said, oh, like users maybe don't know what they want. But this is like actually maybe like an interesting example to think about how data maybe kind of went counterintuitive to what users said they want. The screenshot on the left-hand side is actually a TechCrunch article, a screenshot from 2006, when Facebook first released the newsfeed. At that time, the user research said that users didn't want a newsfeed at all. There was like huge negative backlash on the newsfeed, and these were considered like the perception was overwhelmingly negative. But the numbers showed otherwise. The newsfeed turned out to be a really engaging product for Facebook, and we all know how successful the newsfeed has been. The second screenshot is actually one from like a couple of weeks ago, which is Facebook announcing that they were ending the Explore feed or the Explore feed test because the numbers and the engagement simply weren't there. But in the latter case, users actually thought that like having a place to explore something within Facebook, like where they could discover new types of content that they hadn't connected with, could actually be useful or interesting. But in both of these cases, the user research went counterintuitive to the data itself, and it ended up being totally deceiving. The other example is maybe one that's probably closer to home, and one that relates to experimentation. We all know what is the value of experimentation, but I view experimentation as an extension to user research. Sometimes the amount of user research that you have to do to figure out the right flow is too much, or it's simply not worth it. So this was an experiment that we ran on one of our products, Paper, when the hypothesis was that we could ask new users who are being onboarded onto Paper to invite more people on their teams to join in on that paper doc for collaboration. And the idea was that showing this model to invite more members would essentially drive up team activation. And again, when we were thinking about this flow, the designer came up with a few different types of UI. So you're not going to go in and spend a whole bunch of time like researching with users and figuring out whether like A works better than B, works better than C or D, and so on. Instead, the quick and dirty way to do this is release all of them, run an experiment, and figure out what is valuable and what works best, and which is the winning variant. So experimentation can be a very powerful addition to your user research on top of kind of what I've mentioned earlier around the elements of job theory and the elements of asking questions like why. But user research, when it has a quantitative information, has some pitfalls. The biggest pitfall of quantitative analysis that I've seen is one with bias, where you're running an experiment and your test and control have biases. You are not really measuring truly random things, and your signal is not clean. Surveys are really great to get quantitative information, especially like you want to quantify like, oh, the anecdote like A, like how many people are saying that, anecdote B, how many people are saying that. But the issues with surveys are people end up asking leading questions. Your surveys could be designed to elicit more responses from already highly engaged users or already active users. So it may not be representative of your entire user base. But the bottom line is, as a PM, quantitative techniques are important, but it's up to you to make sure that they have the necessary rigor and validity. So my final takeaway around uncovering truths is to look at user behavior data, whether it's through cookies or through other techniques, to look at those inflection points, to use experimentation, and to really bolster your quantitative analysis with quantitative information. So coming back to where we started off with, the value of user research is to empower people by inspiring empathy and uncovering truths. To empower people, and the next time you're thinking of building a product or thinking about doing user research, think about empowering people. So think about that, putting yourself in the shoes of that milkshake manager, and think about what jobs your product needs to do, or what jobs are your customers trying to do, and how can they hire your product. when you're thinking about deeply empathizing with users, think about how you can create that cupcake experience and ask yourself, why does this matter? Start off with the why and don't underestimate the power of asking why and why now. And finally, uncovering truths. Make sure that you view qualitative information, user stories, anecdotes, as just a part of the puzzle, the other part being quantitative information, where you can use a variety of techniques, metrics, kind of to what Josh alluded to earlier, but make sure that it is unbiased and that you're being rigorous with your approaches. Quick plug for Dropbox. We're growing as a company, so we're hiring a lot of PMs. So if you're interested in a PM role, we're specifically hiring or looking for people who are interested in growth or in analytics. You can reach out to us, or you can look at our career page. But that was what I wanted to cover. Hopefully you got something interesting. Thank you all for coming.